Tears stained her antique lace veil as she stood before a creature of nightmares. Her family sold her to buy their own survival. But when his cold, marble-like hand reached out to gently wipe her cheek, everything she thought she knew about monsters and her own father shattered completely. Boston's elite society has always harbored skeletons in its sprawling, ivy-covered closets, but the Harrington family harbored something far more dangerous. Albert Harrington, CEO of Harrington Biogenetics, presented himself to the world as a pioneer in cellular regeneration. Behind the closed doors of his Beacon Hill mansion, however, he was a key architect in a clandestine treaty that governed an unseen world. He dealt in the currency of immortals, and when his debts came due, his currency was his own daughter, Clara. Clara knew of the shadows. Growing up, she had seen the pale, unnervingly beautiful associates who visited her father's study after midnight. She knew they were vampires, an apex predator species that had integrated seamlessly into the highest echelons of global finance and politics. What she did not know was that the uneasy truce between humanity's elite and the vampire covens was crumbling, and that she would become the sacrifice to patch it. Alistair Covington was the sovereign of the Eastern Seaboard Covens, a title humans crudely translated to Vampire King. He didn't live in a Gothic castle. He operated out of a high-security penthouse in Manhattan and a sprawling, isolated estate in the Adirondacks. He was rumored to be ruthless, a cold tactician who had orchestrated the ruin of entire bloodlines, both human and immortal, who had dared to cross him. When Albert Harrington's illicit side dealings were uncovered by the covens, Alistair demanded a heavy price for the betrayal, a blood-binding marriage to Clara. The wedding took place on a bitter, storm-swept evening in November, inside a deconsecrated cathedral in Providence, Rhode Island. The guest list read, like a who's who of the global elite, senators, pharmaceutical magnates, and shadowy figures who hadn't aged a day in 3 decades. Clara stood in the vestibule, trembling inside a gown of vintage ivory silk that felt more like a burial shroud. Her father Albert stood beside her, his face a mask of calculated indifference. "Stop shaking," Albert hissed, his fingers biting into her arm with enough force to leave bruises. "You will walk down that aisle, you will say the vows, and you will secure this family's future. If you humiliate me tonight, Clara, you know exactly what I am capable of." Clara swallowed hard, the memory of her mother's sudden, unexplained death 5 years prior flashing in her mind. The official story was a rapid, aggressive cancer. The unspoken truth whispered by the household staff was that her mother had tried to leave Albert and take Clara with her. As the heavy oak doors groaned open, a haunting string quartet began to play. Clara walked down the aisle, her vision blurred by the heavy lace veil covering her face. At the altar stood Alistair Covington. He was devastatingly striking, dressed in a bespoke midnight blue suit that absorbed the dim candlelight of the cathedral. His dark hair was meticulously styled, and his features were sharp, aristocratic, and completely devoid of human warmth. But it was his eyes that terrified her, a deep, predatory amber that locked onto her the moment she stepped into the nave. Bishop Charles Linwood, a man who looked like he was mere seconds away from a heart attack, officiated the ceremony in trembling Latin. Clara felt completely detached from her own body. She was 23 years old, being handed over to a 400-year-old apex predator to pay for a corporate sin she didn't even understand. "Do you, Clara Harrington, accept this bond in blood and eternity?" The bishop stammered, his eyes darting nervously toward Alistair. Clara tried to speak, but her throat clamped shut. The sheer terror of her reality finally crashed over her. A single heavy tear broke free, tracking a hot path down her pale cheek, slipping beneath the edge of her veil. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for her father's furious reprimand, waiting for the vampire king to bare his fangs and claim his terrified prey. Instead, the cathedral fell into a deathly, suffocating silence. Alistair stepped forward. He did not ask for permission, as he reached out his long, elegant fingers, lifting the heavy lace veil back over her head. Clara flinched, bracing for pain, but the touch that met her skin was impossibly gentle. Alistair's thumb, cool and smooth, like polished marble, brushed against her cheek, catching the tear before it could fall to her chin. He didn't look angry. He didn't look hungry. As he stared down into her terrified, wide eyes, Clara saw a flicker of something profoundly tragic cross his immortal features. "There is no need for tears tonight, Clara." Alistair murmured, his voice, a rich, dark velvet that seemed to vibrate directly in her chest. He leaned in his lips, hovering mere inches from her ear, ensuring no one else in the cavernous room could hear him. "I am not the monster you should fear." Before she could process his words, Alistair turned his gaze to Albert Harrington. The gentle demeanor vanished instantly, replaced by a terrifying, oppressive aura that made the air in the cathedral drop 10 degrees. "The vows are complete," Alistair declared, his voice echoing off the stone walls. He didn't bother waiting for the bishop to finalize the ritual. He took Clara's hand, resting it on his forearm. "We are leaving." Clara was swept out of the cathedral and into a waiting armored Maybach before her father could even offer a parting word. As the heavy car doors sealed shut, locking her inside with the Vampire King, she realized her nightmare hadn't ended. It had only just begun. The journey to Alistair's primary residence in the Adirondacks was completed in suffocating silence. Clara sat pressed against the far door of the vehicle, clutching her silk shawl like a shield. Alistair sat opposite her, focused entirely on a sleek tablet, scrolling through international market reports with a bored, detached expression. He looked less like a mythical creature of the night, and more like a ruthless venture capitalist. When they finally arrived, Clara was stunned. The estate was a striking brutalist masterpiece of glass and blackened steel jutting aggressively out over the edge of a frozen, moonlit lake. It was surrounded by miles of impenetrable snow-covered forest. There were no guards with crossbows, no dungeon gates, just state-of-the-art security cameras, and a quiet, unassuming human housekeeper named Margaret, who greeted them at the door. "Show my wife to the West Wing," Alistair instructed Margaret without looking at Clara. He handed his tailored coat to the housekeeper. "Ensure she has whatever she needs. Clara, you are free to explore the grounds during the day. At night, I suggest you stay indoors. The woods are not as empty as they appear." With that, he vanished down a long, dimly lit corridor, leaving Clara entirely alone. For the first 3 days, Clara lived in a state of suspended panic. She expected Alistair to come to her room in the dead of night. She expected the bite, the pain, the horrific rituals she had read about in ancient occult texts. But her bedroom door never opened. Her meals were prepared by Margaret and brought to the dining room where Clara ate alone. Alistair was a phantom in his own home, leaving before dawn, and returning long after she had locked herself in her suite. By the 4th day, the terror began to curdle into an overwhelming, restless curiosity. Why had the Vampire King demanded her as a bride, only to ignore her completely? The answer came on a Tuesday afternoon. A massive blizzard had locked the estate in a whiteout, and Margaret was busy in the lower levels managing the generator systems. Clara, feeling bolder in the empty house, wandered into the East Wing, Alistair's private domain. She found his study unlocked. It was a massive 2-story library smelling of old paper leather and rain. At the center sat a massive mahogany desk, cluttered with files, architectural blueprints, and medical dossiers. Clara knew she shouldn't pry, but a folder bearing the logo of Harrington Biogenetics caught her eye. Her father's company. Trembling, she opened it. Inside were not financial ledgers, but deeply disturbing medical and logistics reports. Clara scanned the pages, her brow furrowing in confusion. They were transport manifests, but her father wasn't sending blood to the vampires. He was taking it from them. She flipped to a manifest dated 3 months prior. Subject 04, Coven member subdued. Transported to Harrington Black Site Facility 7. Extraction rate 4 liters per week. Yield destined for Forbes H. and Hayes unforgettable. Clara's breath hitched. Harrison Forbes was a billionaire media mogul. Michael Hayes was a prominent U.S. senator. Both were close friends of her father. Both were men in their late 70s who miraculously looked 40. Her father hadn't been buying protection from the vampires. He had been kidnapping them, draining them in secret black site laboratories, and synthesizing their blood into illegal longevity treatments for the world's wealthiest humans. The treaty between humans and vampires wasn't one of peace. It was a desperate hostage situation. "You're reading it backward, Clara." Clara screamed, spinning around, dropping the folder. The papers scattered across the Persian rug. Alistair stood in the doorway. He wasn't wearing his usual sharp suits. Instead, he wore a simple black cashmere sweater and dark trousers, looking shockingly casual, yet undeniably lethal. He stepped into the room, the door clicking shut behind him. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to," Clara stammered, backing up until her hips hit the edge of the desk. Alistair didn't look angry. He calmly knelt down and began gathering the scattered papers. "Your father is a very resourceful man," Alistair said softly, his amber eyes fixed on the documents. "For decades the Covens maintained a strict rule. We do not turn humans, and we do not grant them our blood. Immortality in the hands of human politicians and billionaires would fracture the world. But Albert discovered a loophole. He found a way to synthesize our plasma, to bottle our life force." He stood up, placing the folder back on the desk, stepping within inches of Clara. She could feel the unnatural cold radiating from his skin. "We caught him," Alistair continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "My enforcers raided Facility 7. We found 4 of my kind, chained to medical tables, bled dry to keep men like Senator Hayes looking youthful for his re-election campaigns." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "If you knew what he was doing, why didn't you just kill him? Why demand me?" Alistair's gaze softened slightly, tracing the contours of her face, as if looking for a ghost. "Because if I killed Albert Harrington, his contingency plan would activate. He has the identities and locations of every Coven leader on the eastern seaboard loaded onto a dead man's switch. If his heart stops, humanity learns we exist, and a global war begins." He took a slow step closer. Clara didn't back away this time. "I took you, Clara," Alistair said, his eyes darkening with a heavy, ancient sorrow, "because you are his only weakness. You are the collateral that ensures he dismantles the black sites. You aren't my food, and you aren't my prisoner. You are my shield against a war." Clara's mind raced, connecting the horrific dots of her entire life. Her father's coldness, the sudden wealth. And then a sickening realization struck her like a physical blow. "My mother," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. "She found out, didn't she? That's why she died." Alistair closed his eyes, a muscle feathering in his jaw. When he opened them, the raw honesty in his gaze shattered the last of Clara's defenses. "Your mother was a brave woman. She came to me 5 years ago, trying to warn the Covens about Albert's experiments. I promised her safe passage out of Boston. I was 1 night too late." The tears Clara had been holding back for days finally spilled over. The monster she had been terrified of had tried to save her mother. The father she had trusted was a butcher. Clara collapsed against the edge of the desk, sobbing into her hands. The world as she knew it had just burned to ash. Alistair moved instinctively. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He stepped into her space, gently pulling her trembling frame against his chest. His arms wrapped around her, solid and unyielding, offering an anchor in the storm of her grief. As Clara cried into the dark cashmere of his sweater, the Vampire King rested his chin on the top of her head, vowing silently that Albert Harrington's reign of terror was nearing its bloody end. Snow lashed against the reinforced glass of the study, mirroring the violent tempest raging inside Clara's mind. For hours she sat by the roaring fireplace, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, while Alistair methodically outlined the true scope of her father's empire. The monster she had feared was in reality a warden trying to stop a global catastrophe. Albert Harrington's ambitions extended far beyond keeping a few corrupt politicians young. As Alistair projected encrypted files onto a sleek wall monitor, Clara realized the horrifying scale of Harrington biogenetics. Her father wasn't just selling longevity, he was actively lobbying the Department of Defense. "Look at this," Alistair said, his voice a low rumble as he tapped the tablet, bringing up heavily redacted financial routing numbers. "Your father is preparing to pitch a derivative of our synthesized plasma to DARPA. He's masking it under the guise of an advanced battlefield trauma solution, claiming it accelerates cellular regeneration. If the US military acquires this serum, Albert will need a localized industrial-scale supply of my kind to meet production quotas." Clara stared at the screen, her eyes tracing the familiar corporate logos involved in the supply chain. She recognized shadow accounts tied to BlackRock and offshore shell companies that had previously attempted hostile takeovers of pharmaceutical giants like Pfizer. Her father was using Wall Street infrastructure to fund supernatural human trafficking. "Why hasn't the dead man's switch been triggered by an outside hacker?" Clara asked, her analytical mind, honed by a master's degree in systems engineering from MIT, finally kicking into gear. "If you know where the servers are, why not launch a cyber attack?" Alistair sat in the leather armchair opposite her, resting his elbows on his knees. "Because the switch isn't purely digital. Albert integrated it into the biometric security grid of an Amazon Web Services data center in Ashburn, Virginia. It requires a daily cryptographic key generated by his own heartbeat, transmitted via a subcutaneous monitor. If the signal drops, or if the server detects a brute force hack, it automatically mass emails the identities, high-resolution thermal imaging, and addresses of every vampire coven to the Senate Intelligence Committee, Interpol, and the press. It's impenetrable." Clara's pulse quickened. A forgotten memory surfaced, breaking through the fog of her grief. "It isn't impenetrable," she whispered, her eyes widening. Alistair looked up, his amber eyes sharpening with intense focus. "What do you mean, my mother?" Clara breathed, standing up and shedding the blanket. Before she died, she worked as the lead cryptographer for Albert's early biotech ventures. She always wore a vintage platinum locket. The night she passed away, she forced it into my hand and made me swear never to open it, never to let Albert see it. She said it was my insurance policy. Clara rushed out of the study and sprinted down the corridor to her suite, Alistair moving silently on her heels. She tore through her velvet jewelry box, her trembling fingers finally retrieving the heavy tarnished locket. She brought it back to the study and placed it on Alistair's mahogany desk. With a hairpin, Clara bypassed the broken clasp and popped the locket open. Inside wasn't a photograph, but a micro SD card, seamlessly embedded into the metal backing. Alistair's tech specialists, a team of vampires operating out of a subterranean bunker in Brooklyn, analyzed the drive remotely within minutes. The results left the Vampire King momentarily speechless. "It's a master override sequence," Alistair said, a rare note of astonishment coloring his velvet voice. "Your mother secretly hard-coded a back door into Albert's central server architecture before she was discovered. It can spoof the biometric heartbeat signal, keeping the dead man's switch asleep indefinitely even if Albert's heart stops." But there's a catch, Clara noted, reading the terminal output on the screen. The override can't be executed remotely. It requires a physical hardline connection directly at the Ashburn AWS server farm, and it requires a biometric match to activate. Albert's DNA, Alistair concluded grimly. No, Clara said, stepping closer to Alistair, her chin raised in newfound defiance. Mine. I share his DNA. My mother programmed the back door to recognize my genetic signature. She knew that if she failed, I would be the only one who could finish it. Alistair looked down at her. The fragile, terrified girl shivering in a wedding dress was gone. In her place stood a woman forged in the fires of betrayal, ready to tear down her father's empire. It is too dangerous, Alistair said, softly, reaching out to gently tuck a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His touch sent an electric shock straight down her spine. If Albert's private security catches you in that facility, I will not be able to protect you without exposing my kind. You didn't marry a coward, Alistair, Clara replied, holding his gaze, refusing to back down from the apex predator. You married a Harrington. It's time I use that name to destroy him. A ghost of a smile touched Alistair's lips. It was a breathtaking sight, softening the sharp, dangerous angles of his face. Then we move tonight. The AWS server farm in Ashburn, Virginia, looked like a sprawling, windowless concrete fortress. Under the cover of a freezing, moonless night, Alistair's elite extraction team disabled the perimeter security using localized EMPs. They moved like phantoms, silent, impossibly fast, and entirely lethal. Clara walked in the center of the formation, clad in tactical black, her heart hammering against her ribs. Alistair flanked her, his presence a heavy, comforting gravity. They breached the main server floor, a massive, temperature-controlled cavern filled with endless rows of blinking server racks. The hum of cooling fans was deafening. Clara moved swiftly toward the central terminal, plugging a decryption interface into the mainframe. Authorization required. The automated voice echoed through the cold room. Clara pressed her palm against the biometric scanner. The system whirred, processing her DNA. She held her breath. Suddenly, the blinding fluorescent lights of the server floor snapped on. I always knew your mother was too clever for her own good. A chilling, familiar voice echoed from the steel catwalk above. Clara froze. Albert Harrington stood overlooking the server floor, flanked by a dozen heavily armed private military contractors. Their rifles were equipped with specialized ultraviolet laser sights, military-grade tech, designed specifically to blind and burn vampire retinas. You truly thought I wouldn't monitor the primary physical access point of my life's work. Albert sneered, descending the metal stairs. He looked at Alistair with utter disgust. I gave you my daughter to buy time, Covington. Time to finalize my DoD contracts. Now you've obligingly delivered yourselves into a localized UV grid. Albert pressed a button on a remote in his hand. Instantly, high-intensity ultraviolet floodlights dropped from the ceiling, bathing the room in artificial, agonizing sunlight. Alistair's team dropped to their knees, their skin beginning to violently blister and smoke. Alistair groaned, shielding Clara with his own body as his suit began to singe. "Stop!" Clara screamed, lunging in front of Alistair. "I'll give you the drive, Albert. Just shut the lights off." "You have nothing to bargain with, Clara." Albert laughed coldly, stepping up to the console. He reached for her throat, intending to drag her away from the terminal. But Albert had vastly underestimated the monster he was dealing with. Ignoring the agonizing burn searing across his flesh, Alistair moved with a speed that defied physics. He seized Albert's wrist before the man could touch Clara. The sickening crunch of shattering bone echoed over the hum of the servers. Albert shrieked in agony, dropping the remote control. Clara didn't hesitate. She stomped on the remote, shattering it, and slammed her hand back onto the biometric scanner. Genetic match confirmed. Override protocol initiated, the computer announced. Deadman switch deactivated. With the failsafe offline, Alistair's restraint evaporated. He unleashed a terrifying primal roar. His amber eyes bled into a piercing, luminous crimson. In a matter of seconds, the sophisticated, restrained CEO vanished, replaced by the apex predator that had ruled the shadows for 4 centuries. Alistair tore through the armed contractors. He didn't kill them, he merely dismantled them, moving fast enough to dodge the UV lasers, breaking rifles and shattering kneecaps until the entire security detail was groaning on the floor. He then turned back to Albert, lifting the billionaire by the collar of his bespoke suit, hoisting him 3 feet off the ground. "Your immunity is revoked, Albert." Alistair snarled his fangs fully, extended his face inches from the terrified human. "Wait," Clara called out. Her voice was steady, cutting through the chaos. Alistair paused, looking back at her, his crimson eyes slowly returning to amber as her presence grounded him. "Don't kill him," Clara said, stepping forward. She looked at her father, feeling nothing but profound pity and disgust. "Death is too quick. Let him live in the hell he created." Clara tapped a few final commands into the terminal. "I just forwarded the unredacted ledgers of Harrington Biogenetics to the SEC, the FBI, and the investigative journalism desk at the New York Times. I stripped out all mentions of the covens. To the world, Albert Harrington isn't a supernatural trafficker. He's just another greedy billionaire who embezzled billions from BlackRock, committed massive tax fraud, and conducted illegal medical trials on human trafficking victims. He will spend the rest of his natural, pathetic life in a federal supermax prison." Albert paled, realizing his empire was entirely gone. Alistair dropped him to the floor in a heap of defeated flesh. Within minutes, the distant wail of police sirens began to echo outside the facility. Alistair wrapped his scorched, heavy coat around Clara's shoulders, leading her out through the loading docks and into the freezing Virginia night, slipping away before the authorities breached the building. 3 weeks later, the world watched as Albert Harrington was indicted on 73 counts of federal fraud and human rights violations. The stock of Harrington Biogenetics plummeted to 0. The black sites were quietly dismantled by Alistair's operatives. The captive vampires returned to their covens to heal. Clara stood on the balcony of the Adirondack estate, looking out over the frozen lake. She was no longer a frightened captive. She had inherited her father's vast, legitimate offshore trusts, using the wealth to quietly fund disaster relief and medical research, the real kind. The sliding glass door opened, and Alistair stepped out into the biting cold. His burns had completely healed, his marble-like skin flawless once again. He handed her a steaming mug of tea, standing beside her as the snow began to fall. "The eastern seaboard covens are safe," Alistair said quietly, his shoulder brushing against hers. "And the treaty is completely rewritten. You saved us, Clara." Clara took a sip of the tea, the warmth radiating through her chest. "We saved each other." Alistair turned to face her, his amber eyes soft, devoid of the predatory edge that the world saw. He reached out his cool thumb, gently brushing her cheek exactly as he had done on their wedding day. But this time she didn't flinch. This time there were no tears to wipe away. The terms of our marriage were dictated by blackmail. Alistair murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips. "You are free to leave, Clara. The world is yours." Clara smiled, stepping into his space, wrapping her free hand in the lapel of his black cashmere coat. "And why would I leave?" she whispered, leaning up until her breath mingled with the freezing air between them. "When I have finally found where I belong." As the Vampire King pulled his queen into a deep, desperate kiss under the falling snow, Clara knew that out of the ashes of a nightmare, they had forged an empire of their own. If Clara and Alistair's dark journey captivated you, don't let the story end here. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with your fellow romance and thriller lovers. What would you have done in Clara's shoes? Drop a comment below and let us know. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on our thrilling, real-life inspired tales. Until next time, stay safe and keep reading the shadows.